Everyone. My name is Ralph Neese, and I'm the Senior Counsel for Voting Rights at the Century Foundation, TCF. On behalf of TCF and its president, Mark Zuckerman, and on behalf of the Albert Shanker Institute and its executive director, Mary Catherine Shanker, I welcome you to this event and thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being part of this. A couple of housekeeping points. Number one, this is being recorded. Number two, it'll be live streamed on YouTube. And number three, we'll have a Q&A function. So if you have questions to submit, please do. A personal minute, if I may. I've been extremely fortunate, blessed even, to have participated in the enactment of every major disability rights law since 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. And I learned something then that I've never forgotten. Disability rights are voting rights. And we've made a lot of progress. We got some ways to go, but we've made a lot of progress. But we're here today to address what I think is the most serious civil rights challenge we have faced in more than a couple of generations. Sadly, in a number of states, at least 19, there have been 33 voter suppression laws that could disenfranchise millions of American voters, and disproportionately impacted would be people with disabilities, older Americans, veterans, and low-income citizens. For many years, I was a disciple of a principal mentor by the name of Justin Dart, the Martin Luther King of the disability rights movement. And he would always say, vote as your life depended on it, because it does. With that stark but apt and hopefully inspirational start, with respect to Justin's quote, I want to introduce Judy Heumann, another mentor, a longtime friend, and founding parent of the modern disability rights movement. Judy?
Thank you very much, Ralph. And thank you for all the work you and others have been doing on putting this event together today. Voting. My parents are were German Jews. They passed away. And voting was something that was instilled in us from whenever I can remember. And I had polio. I've been using a wheelchair since I was like 2 years old. And issues of accessibility at that point in time weren't even seriously being discussed. So when I was 18 and I voted, my father had to pull me up the stairs to vote, but I voted. And I learned, as I've been actively engaged in the disability rights movement, that voting is a critical instrument to enabling all people, but in this case, disabled people from all backgrounds, to feel like they are a part of the system. And that the changes that we've been making over the years in relationship to state and national laws have really been affected by our ability as disabled people of all ages and all backgrounds to vote and then to participate in the overall process. I have been deeply concerned, like everybody on this call, about the voter suppression which is going on. Voter suppression, to me, continues to reinforce the fact that large swaths of our society are not valued as equal people. That's one of the big challenges going on across the United States, where people whose voices have been repressed are fighting back and are saying that our voice matters, our vote matters. When I moved from Brooklyn to Berkeley and I got involved with the Center for Independent Living, voter registration was something we started right away. It was really important that we wanted every disabled person there to understand that their vote mattered. And that meant that they also became more involved in politics. And that meant that when we saw people were running for office, they would talk about how they were involved with the Berkeley CIL. And that was very influential in being able to get numerous pieces of important legislation. Moving on to Section 504 in the Americans with Disabilities Act. Everyone today who is going to be speaking is committed to ensuring that no person is denied the right to vote. Disabled people are really one of the last groups that are emerging as leaders and as respected people within our society. It is critical that we, as we are, and you'll hear from Maria from AAPD and the great work they're doing, see that every vote counts. And it is our responsibility to ensure that all people who are eligible to vote out of the 60 million disabled people in the US not only see themselves as having the right, but will participate in this fight to make sure that voter suppression stops and that people clearly understand that disabled individuals are a vital part of the United States and that voting is an essential issue for all people. So I want to thank you very much, Ralph, for inviting me to speak this afternoon. And it is really my privilege to be able to introduce Wade Henderson from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Thank you, Wade.
Thank you so much, Judy. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Wade Henderson, Interim President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a coalition of more than 230 national organizations working to build an America as good as its ideals. Now, I want to extend my deepest thanks to the Century Foundation and the Albert Shanker Institute, and especially my friend Ralph Neese and Mary Catherine Ricker for hosting this critically important briefing today. It's an honor to be here with my esteemed colleagues and with all of you tuning in who are working to ensure that every vote counts in our democracy, especially those of the 38 million voters with disabilities who live and vote in every community across the country. Now, we could spend an entire day on this subject, but we will do well with the 40 minutes we have this afternoon. Now, before I go any further, I would like to dedicate this panel to the memory of Senator Bob Dole, who passed earlier in the week. Senator Dole was a great American and a lifelong Republican of character and decency. We disagreed on many issues, but we found common ground on voting rights for all and for the human rights of persons with disabilities. He will be missed. Now, we know that for our democracy to work for all of us, it must include us all. From the passage of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to the American Disabilities Act of 1990 to the present, people with disabilities have made significant progress to secure civil and human rights. Indeed, disability rights are civil and human rights, but we find ourselves in a perilous time with voting rights for all Americans under attack. So let's talk about the challenges we're up against and the way forward. First, allow me to introduce our all-star panel today. The Honorable Tammy Duckworth, U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois, Iraqi war veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and a recipient of the Leadership Conference's highest honor, the Hubert H. Humphrey Civil and Human Rights Award. Senator Duckworth, so good to see you again, and thank you for making time to be with us this afternoon. Mia Eves Roublé, Director of the Disability Justice Initiative at the Center for American Progress. Lisa Shore, Professor of Labor Studies and Employment Relations and Director of the Program for Disability Research at Rutgers University. the renowned program for disability research at Rutgers. And finally, Mary Catherine Ricker of the Albert Shanker Institute. Mary Catherine, so good to have you here with us this afternoon. Thank you to our panelists for being with us today. Now, I'd like to note for our audience that following the panel, we will have time for 2 questions, only 2, but 2 questions. So please drop your questions into the chat box. And now let's get started. Let's begin with some questions for all of our panelists. And I may direct 1 or 2, but I'd like you all to feel that you can engage in this conversation. Let's begin by hearing about the special concerns that people with disabilities have when it comes to voting. Senator Duckworth, can you share with us examples of the kinds of obstacles you have personally encountered as you've attempted to exercise the right to vote?
Thank you, Wade. Thank you for your leadership on this issue and so many others. I'm so proud to be here. And hi to my girlfriend, Judy Human, who just spoke. Well, the last time I went to vote, which was just earlier this year in municipal elections, I went, and it's simple accessibility. I went to my polling station, which has always been accessible. I went in, but the one wheelchair accessible voting machine was broken. In order to vote, luckily I was wearing, for those who don't know, I'm a double leg amputee. So I'm mobile, but I can't, I don't have legs, so I can't stand. Luckily, I was wearing my left prosthetic. So in order to vote, I had to balance myself on my left prosthesis, standing straight up, clutching the voting machine as I'm trying to vote, because it was way up here and I was way down here. Because they only had one machine that was accessible and it was not working. And then at that same election at a different location, a friend of mine who was also is a wheelchair user, she was trying to vote and there was an accessible voting machine, but it was all in Chinese. It was broken because the language function was broken. And thank goodness there happened to be an election judge who read Mandarin and had to translate it all for her so she could vote. So it's simple. You wouldn't think that in 2021, simple accessibility is still an issue 30 years after passage of the ADA, but it is.
Wow. Thank you for sharing those really powerful stories. What about our other panelists? Lisa?
Yeah, I just want to make a very quick point that inaccessible voting systems, whether it's broken machines like Senator Duckworth encountered, or difficulty getting in, or even like doors that open outwards that are heavy to open, all these barriers, they not only make it physically difficult for people with disabilities to vote, but they also send the message that people with disabilities aren't important and that they don't matter to the political system. And that's something that we have to fight, I would say, with every fiber of our beings. And that is really the challenge going forward. People with disabilities do matter. And we need to make sure that polling places and all polling systems reflect that.
Mia?
Yeah, I think I wanted to make just a couple of points. One is that I don't think that the needs of disabled people, the accommodations that they need are anything special. It's a necessity. It's something that is required by law and should be done to ensure that at least the 1 in 4 people in the US who have disabilities have access to the polls. We also know that, in the 2020 presidential election, that roughly 1 in every 9 disabled voters faced barriers to accessing the ballot box. And that's an extreme problem that 1 in 9 people had difficulties going to the polls. I think also that one of the things that needs to be understood is that roughly 51% of disabled voters cast their ballots by mail last year. And these laws that are trying to curb mail-in ballot will directly affect these voters. So I think it's really important to understand that a lot of these barriers aren't special, but they that the barriers, that we need to make accessibility and accommodations something that is just a built-in function into our voting.
Mhm. Well, Mia, you noted correctly that many of these requirements, though not special, are not being enforced under existing law. We're going to talk a bit more about that in the course of our panel, but let me call on Mary Catherine to see if she has examples of problems that are talking about. Mary Catherine?
Thanks so much, Wade. And I really appreciate being able to step in for Schenker Institute board president and AFT president Randy Weingarten, who had a conflict today. And I just want to say that there is a connection here. There's an overlap between what educators do to provide a free, appropriate public education and the natural instinct to make sure that we should then, as we apply that idea, those ideals to our democracy, that we apply those accommodations to voting as well. When you build accommodations in at the front end of anything, whether that is that public education and whether that is voting, you are making voting accessible to everyone, and everyone feels invited and valued and that their rights are being acknowledged. When you leave it out entirely, or to Maria's point, you institute laws that are restricting early voting or vote by mail, or in the case of Senator Duckworth's experiences where the polling place is not accommodating, not welcoming, you are definitely sending a message to 1 in 4 voters that their vote doesn't matter. And one of the things that's exciting about today's event is that we're going to expose those things and we're going to offer alternatives because every vote matters and every vote matters.
Mary Catherine, that's very helpful, and you're absolutely right. And you are right that Senator Duckworth outlined a number of barriers that send a clear and unmistakable signal that people with disabilities are not valued in the system. And quite frankly, the system is indifferent to your circumstance one way or the other. Mia's observation about the mail-in ballot is so important. It leads me to my second question for the entire panel. And all of you know, and Ralph mentioned in his introduction, that 19, and I want to emphasize this not for partisan purposes, but because it is true, 19 Republican-controlled state legislatures have passed 33 new anti-voter bills just this year. Now, what will the impact of these laws on vulnerable voting populations, including people with disabilities, people of color, older Americans, veterans, low-income voters? What will the impact of those new provisions be? Mia, you started us on this panel. Why don't you pick it up? Started on this question.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand that people don't live one-dimensional lives, right? So individuals can be disabled, they can be also racial minority, can also be low income. We know that 1 in 4 Black Americans have a disability, and 3 in 10 American Indians and Alaskan Natives are disabled, that 1/3 of adults in rural communities are disabled, and that 25.9% of disabled people are living in poverty. So an understanding that disabled people can face, double, triple burdens to trying to access the polls and be able to deal with the barriers around anti-voting laws. So when we're looking at issues, we can look at anything from strict voter ID laws to signature matching requirements, polling place closures in BIPOC communities, right? We saw that in Georgia, where they were literally using the ADA as a reason to close polls in a low-income Black majority county, which actually restricted disabled Black and brown individuals from being able to vote. So it's the understanding that all of these laws are specifically targeting this massive amount of vulnerable populations to disenfranchise them.
Wow. Are there other observations among panelists? I think Mia is absolutely right. Any other considerations?
Well, I would just, I'm coming from a very political perspective, but
Yeah,
many of these voting right laws are aimed directly at people who tend to vote Democratic, and multiple Republican legislators at state and federal levels have actually admitted this and said it out loud. The laws in Georgia, for example, are aimed directly at Senator Warnock's voters, and they've said so. So really, they're trying to choose the voters so that they can win elections. And I'm sorry to say that that's the case, but that's what's happening.
wow.
They want to restrict the people who want. And I'm not saying that they want to restrict specifically Democratic voters, but voters who are going to vote for more rights for persons with disabilities, voters who are going to vote for immigration reform, voters who are going to vote for ending the backlog and getting home health care aids, voters who are going to vote for some sort of a universally accessible healthcare system. That's who they want to restrict from voting. Well, voters with disabilities fit squarely into that block, however they identify, whatever political party. But that also happens to be largely people who vote Democratic, and because they don't want to have people elected who are going to support immigration reform, who are going to support universal health care, all of those things, which are important to the disability community.
Given our concerns about voting rights in the states, there's a natural question that flows from this, and that let's talk about what Congress can do, because obviously these voting laws are regulated by Congress. Now, just to inform our audience a bit about some of the changes that have been happening at the state level, in 2013, in June of 2013, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, invalidated a key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, known as preclearance. And preclearance was a provision that applied to about 13 states that had a history of past discrimination, certainly on the basis of race. Now, many of these states were part of the old Confederacy. They had a real history of making an effort to block Black voters. But, there's real intersectionality here, because when you block a particular community from voting, as in the African-American community, you're affecting a lot of communities of low-income people, people of color, people with disabilities. And the fact that so many people with disabilities are, of course, also members of the Black community, the brown community, the LGBTQ community, there's a lot of intersectionality, colleagues, so that when these new laws are applied in strict ways, they have a broad impact. Again, Senator Duckworth, let's start with you. What do you think Congress can do to really address some of these issues?
Well, we can pass any number of voting rights legislation. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act is a good one, which would re-enshrine the right to vote and counter a lot of the reinstatement has happened at the state level, very Jim Crow policy. I mean, we're well on the path to tell us how many jelly beans are in the jar before you can vote. We are on the path to that. We're laughing, but it's true,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And what's so egregious is that these laws have significant penalties now. So you could actually be arrested and jailed, for example, if your signature on your absentee ballot application doesn't match the signature that you sign on the outside of the absentee ballot envelope. I mean, they're trying to scare people from voting early and scaring people from registering others to vote. And they've made the penalties one that are very serious penalties, so that people will think twice about, even applying for absentee ballots. So yes, I've been on the record as I am supportive of changing, if we have to, filibuster policies within the Senate. It's not in the Constitution how we run the filibuster, and to restore it to what it was, which is that instead of you have to have 60 votes to pass legislation, you have to, in fact, instead have 41 votes to stop legislation. And so filibuster reform is very much on the table, but we have to pass one of these voting rights, like pieces of voting rights reform legislation that has been proposed. I would prefer the John Lewis Act, But if not, there's a number of others that would at least begin to restore voting rights to Americans.
You know, Senator, before I call on your other co-panelists, I have to say for our audience, what a real leader you have been in the Senate in trying to advance voting rights legislation for all. Colleagues, we have two bills that are pending. We're going to talk about them in a little bit, but one is the Freedom to Vote Act, which is critically important, and the other is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And we in the civil rights community and the election community generally know that we need both bills. Both bills are critically important to the interests that we share in common. But before we unpack that a bit more, let me call on Lisa and Mary Catherine and Mia to see if they have any observations here. Lisa, what's your thinking? You're on mute.
I just want to affirm what Senator Duckworth said. Clearly making it more difficult to vote has a disparate impact on people with disabilities, even if they are not the direct target of it, and sometimes they are the direct target. And I totally support your efforts. I just want to say one thing. I completely agree with you in terms of intentions of these voting so-called reforms, but I just want to mention that if you look at the partisan identification of people with disabilities, they pretty much fall out the way the rest of the population does in the US. So it's not necessarily a Democratic issue or a Republican issue, because people with disabilities, again, are not overwhelmingly identified with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. So this is really a human rights issue.
Absolutely. As Bob Dole, whom I mentioned earlier, knew, voting is not a partisan issue. It's a national issue. And voting rights are issues that are supported by both. And when the Voting Rights Act was last reauthorized in 2006, in the Senate alone, we had a vote of 98-0, which meant that senators from both parties, including 13 Republicans who are currently serving in the Senate today, voted for voting rights. And here's the irony. That 13 that supported voting rights in 2006 have turned their backs and won't even support to start the debate on voting rights legislation in this current Congress. It's really outrageous. Mary Catherine, what do you think?
I think you started by asking what Congress should do. And of
Yeah.
course, Senator Duckworth pointed out that there is no shortage of action they can take. And there is absolutely work to address the filibuster, which needs to happen. And so I will actually just add to that we have a responsibility as citizens to make sure that not only do we vote, but that we advocate so that everyone who is eligible can vote and that every vote is counted. And part of that is this discussion today and what we will walk away with, the commitments we'll walk away with, so that Congress does do what Senator Duckworth laid out for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Mia?
Yeah, I can't add much more to
Okay.
what everybody else is saying. I think it's extremely important to understand that a lot of the impacts on disabled people, unfortunately, we've seen attacks against disability rights on both sides, unfortunately, including attacks on the ADA, which thank you, Senator Duckworth, for your massive amount of work, making sure that we don't continue to erode the ADA and some of these erroneous bills around notification, et cetera. But yeah, I think it's really important to understand that disabled people run the gamut in terms of political power, that individuals, particularly as they are aging, are going to need more and more accommodations and are going to fall into into needing disability access or accommodations. So if you are an individual that is trying to attack the ability for folks, particularly disabled people, being able to vote, you may be harming your own constituencies. So I think that's really important to understand, is that the harms that you do right now can cause significant ripple effects throughout the system and throughout impacting your own constituents.
Mia, that's such an astute observation. Several years ago, a friend who was a disability advocate once referred to me as a TAB, a TAB. I said, a TAB? What's a TAB? Oh, you are the temporarily able-bodied. I said, oh. So as we age, there is often a challenge, and we can all benefit from disability supports. Let me go back to something that Senator Duckworth raised and then see if we can set the context for this conversation, and that is the Senate filibuster. Okay, she mentioned the filibuster. And so by way of background for our audience, you should know, as I mentioned, there are two pending voting rights bills. One, the Freedom to Vote Act, the other known as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis bill have both passed the House of Representatives. They are the pending business now in the Senate, and we need the Senate to pass both bills. The bills need to be conferenced between the House and Senate, and then they need to have a final vote and signed into law. Some of you remember Schoolhouse Rock and the little video about how a bill becomes law. Well, just think of that, because that's absolutely right. And we need it done in both instances sooner rather than later. I think most of you know that the census data, which is gathered every 10 years, is used by states to redistrict, meaning to establish their congressional districts that population adjustments will demand. And they also redistrict at the local level, city council, school districts, and so forth. So census data plays an important part. Our states are required to make adjustments every decade, and the adjustments are often done in a very partisan way, meaning they are done by those in control to advance their political control of a state. But sometimes that redistricting can be done not just in a partisan way, but in a racial way, a way that is intended to diminish those who have political power because of adjustments taking place at the state level. So let me give you an example. In North Carolina, the population between Democrats and Republicans is pretty much equal. But Republicans do control the state legislature, even though you may have a Democratic governor. The state legislature has proposed a redistricting map, a set of maps this year, that don't really balance out a sort of 50-50 allocation of political power. And in terms of their congressional districts, would allocate an 11-3 Republican to Democratic advantage. Now, some of that, from our perspective, has a racial dimension. And there are huge problems at the state and local level that are still taking place in voting. And as a matter of fact, I would direct you to the Leadership Conference website, www.civilrights.org. There you will find a voting rights section in which you will see 13 state reports that have been prepared by significant law firms, the Lawyers Committee, the Legal Defense Fund, and others, ACLU, to help show what's happening at the state level in terms of specific aspects of discrimination. So it's important that you see that. Why do I mention all of that? Well, I mention that because right now in the Senate, as is the case with the Build Back Better plan, Democrats are debating among themselves about how to use their political power to advance voting rights. And while there is a strong commitment to passing voting rights legislation, as Senator Duckworth, I'm sure, can attest, there are concerns among some about removing the procedure known as the filibuster, which stands as a barrier to passing these bills in the Senate. Currently, a majority vote of 51 votes or 50 votes, depending upon the election, is not enough to move a bill forward or to pass it. Because of the filibuster, one needs a vote of 60 members to demonstrate that you can, in fact, pass a bill. 60 votes means in an evenly divided Senate that you need at least 10 Republican votes to move it forward. And right now, that has created a real problem. And I'm going to ask Senator Duckworth to mention that a minute and then ask my other colleagues. But let me give you Wade's laws of the political universe, which is one of the concerns. I know Senator Duckworth, I'm presumptuous here, but it's the laws of the political universe. And I think you can see how they apply in the case of some of these bills, particularly voting. And those laws are 3 laws. Republicans fall in line. Republicans fall in line. Democrats fall in love. Democrats fall in love. And progressives multiply through division. Progressives multiply through division. Those are Wade's 3 laws of the political universe. And I think you see them in application in a number of different ways. Senator Duckworth, let me ask you, what do you think the chances of moving forward in resolving the filibuster might be?
I think the only path right now is to restore it to a talking filibuster. Right now, where we sit, up until the election in 2022, in November of 2022, it's 50 senators on the Democratic side and 50 Republican senators. And among the Democrats, Senators Sinema and Manchin have indicated that they do not support eliminating the filibuster for legislation. Now, remember that it's been eliminated for just about everything else.
Yep.
It's been eliminated for judicial nominees, for example, the Supreme Court. The justices that were seated during the Trump administration were elected with just the 51 votes, not with the filibuster vote level from previously. And so where we are now is it's just a legislative filibuster that is left. And so the 2 of them have said they won't vote to end that, but they've both left open the door for filibuster reform, which is to restore it to what it was pre-Jim Crow era, which means that if you want to put an amount of filibuster, you've got to stand on the Senate floor and talk that entire time. Right now, you can just say, I want to filibuster voting rights legislation. And just by saying that, you've mounted the filibuster, and you can go on vacation to Cancun if you want to. You don't have to actually stand on the floor and defend it. When you tell most people filibuster, they think that you're, Mr. Smith goes to Washington,
Yes.
standing on the floor speaking nonstop. No, all you do now is just say, okay, I'm mounting a filibuster, and then you can just go on vacation. So restoring it, I think, is the path forward. Now, if a miracle happens and we get significantly, and I don't think it's that big of a miracle, I think we could probably do it. If we can get 53 senators on the Democratic side post 2022, then we could probably end the filibuster, because you would have, well, depending on who the 2 new senators would be, then Sinema and Manchin can vote to oppose it, and we would still get to the 51 votes. So the most likely path forward is to restore it to a talking filibuster. And then I think we would be able to pass some of this legislation.
I think that's so important. Here's the irony, colleagues. Here's the irony. It only takes 51 votes to put someone on the Supreme Court who will threaten our political interests, yours and mine. And yet it takes 60 votes to pass a bill to protect our interests. Okay? So the idea that you can, the system is rigged, I'm afraid, colleagues, in a way that doesn't advance the interests of democracy as we understand it. Now, we've been dealing at the sort of 60,000 foot level in talking about these voting rights bills, but there's some details with the Freedom to Vote Act that are really noteworthy, and I want to just bring out a couple of them. And I just want you to know that Senator Manchin, who has been mentioned by Senator Duckworth as someone who has not been anxious to move forward on the filibuster, did in fact have a great influence in shaping the Freedom to Vote Act, and did so in a very positive way. So here's a couple of examples. Election day under the Freedom to Vote Act would be a national holiday. There would be 2 weeks of continuous early voting that would allow people to vote early. Mail-in voting and ballots that Mia mentioned were so important to people with disabilities would be preserved and encouraged. A multiplicity of ID could be used to establish your identity. Now, I know, there have been many concerns about voter ID. I share them. But if you have to have voter ID, We should have a multiplicity of documents that allow people, including people with disabilities, to establish who they are, to have drop boxes so that you can drop off a ballot in every major county without having to be concerned about where you will get your ballot ultimately dropped and counted. Making sure that election administrators are nonpartisan and protected. A number of states are enacting new provisions, by the way, that are putting partisan hacks in control of who counts the ballots. And that is a huge fear for our democracy going forward. It would ban those ridiculous audits that are taking place now in states that have already been won by the previous president, and nonetheless are being used to suggest that somehow voter irregularities, voter fraud was in effect. It would regulate how campaign expenditures are made in a positive way. Dark money would be challenged under this bill. So the Freedom to Vote Act is critically important. And it's as important as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We need them both. Right now, there is some concern about how these bills will move in the Senate. But look, let me give credit to Senator Schumer, because I think it is important to note that the majority leader is working aggressively. Senator Duckworth is part of that effort to bring Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema around to supporting modifications in the filibuster. There are major efforts underway. There's a story in today's Politico, which suggests that there are efforts underway. No one wants to talk specifically about what the deals entail, but Senator Duckworth is absolutely right. People are looking very carefully at how they can calibrate adjustments to the filibuster in ways that make it work. So this is a very important time for our democracy. It's in peril. American democracy is in peril. We are just about a few weeks away, less than a month away, from the anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, a failed coup d'etat against American democracy. Don't kid yourself. We are not out of the woods. We have many threats that we still have, that we still face. But here's the final question before we turn to a couple of questions from the audience, and that is, what is our advice, colleagues, collectively, for what people can now do concerning protecting voting rights for people with disabilities? What suggestions would you make? What should people in our communities do to address this issue? Senator Duckworth, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think there's two groups of action. One, which is personal action.
Mhm.
I think you should do two things. One, make sure you're registered to vote and that you do turn out to vote.
Mhm.
And two, you need to be contacting your state legislators, your governors, and also your congressional delegation, and to tell them that this is important to you and you want this to pass. Those are two critical ones. Those are the personal things you can do. The other is to be part of a movement to get people registered to vote. These laws are trying their hardest to keep people from being able to vote. So you have to counter them by redoubling our efforts to get people to vote and really get people to participate. This, and this includes not just voting, but also the census. I know the census just passed, but let me give you a lesson learned. New York, the state of New York, lost one congressional seat. In order to have a member of Congress represents about 735,000 individuals. They were 89 people short on returning the census. And they lost a congressional seat in New York.
Wow.
So 726,000 people are going to lose a congressman because 89 people did not return the census form. We have to participate, and we have to get everyone to participate and be counted.
A great example.
And voting is how you can be counted.
Great example.
Thank you.
Lisa, what do you think?
Yeah, I want to just support what Senator Duckworth said and what you said. I want to add that a lot of education is necessary, a lot of outreach, and I want to give a shout out to online groups like RevUp, which reach a lot of people virtually. A lot of people, for various reasons, a lot of people with disabilities, especially during the pandemic, may not feel comfortable being in physical rallies with other people and so forth, but a wonderful way to get involved and to educate people and reach out is through online groups. So I want to support that.
That's great. Mia, what's your thinking? What do you
There's a
think people-
couple of things that I am thinking. I think one is legislatively, of course, finding out what your laws are locally in your state and start doing advocacy work and to your local state representatives. Also doing federal advocacy, so pushing for the John Lewis voting rights bill. I think you can also do things that are much smaller, but have just as much impact, which includes volunteering to help register people to vote, volunteering to ensure that you're doing poll monitoring to ensure people aren't disenfranchised and dissuaded from being able to vote, providing transportation access if that is currently legal in your state, since we know Georgia and Texas are pushing back against some of those ways to assist. But figuring out ways that you can help in your community are just some of the small ways. And even if you have a disability and are an individual that is stuck at home, there are tons of ways that you can get involved with your local groups to help provide some of that assistance to voters.
Thank you. Mary Catherine.
Yeah, thank you. So first, again, voting rights are being attacked. And so to borrow that phrase, Wade, the temporarily able-bodied, if you are temporary and able-bodied, actively look for solidarity opportunities to work alongside, advocate alongside, take the lead from the community of activists in the disability community who are telling you that their voting rights are being attacked, and do what they tell you to do to support their voting rights. Vote yourself, as Senator Duckworth said. At the state, tell your U.S. senators this is a priority. Call the U.S. Senate 202-224-3121 and tell them you expect action on voting rights. Those are all the things we can be doing to actively make sure that we are supporting the rights for everyone to vote, no exceptions.
Well, thank you for that. And guys, we are sort of running out of time. So I'm going to make two quick observations about what we can do. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who has, I believe, some findings that will be shared with the audience, which I'm looking forward to. So let me say a couple of things. And I have found this panel to be incredibly enlightening. And hearing Senator Duckworth of your challenges at the ballot and others in trying to vote, and Mia, as you pointed out, this is the law. This is the law. So I think we need to do a couple of things. I'm going to talk with my colleague, Maria Town of AAPD, which, by the way, is a member of the Leadership Conference. I'm so honored to have AAPD on our board of directors. I'm going to talk with Maria about doing what I call a quick and dirty report to try to document some of the instances like those of Senator Duckworth in the challenges of people with disabilities in going to the polls. So Senator Duckworth, I know you have to jump off in just a minute to go to vote and take care of business. Let me say how much we all appreciate your contribution today and all that you do to help protect the rights of all of us. It's such an honor to have you with us. So thank you so much for doing everything. We really appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you.
And I would just say, I'm going to work with Maria to see if we can document some instances where people with disabilities are facing untoward challenges that should have been remedied at the local level, to really highlight the failure of states and, for that matter, the federal government to really enforce our requirements of our existing laws to ensure that people with disabilities are protected. Secondly, I'm going to talk with Maria and others in the disability community about raising the voices of persons with disabilities so that people understand on the Hill that this issue affects people in a broad swath, including members of their own families. And they need to be aware of that. And they need to know that these barriers are completely unjustified, contrary to our existing laws, and should be remedied. And then finally, we're going to talk about encouraging the Department of Justice to be more aggressive in enforcing these laws at the state and local level. I think it's very clear that more could be done. Even having the Attorney General raise these issues with state attorneys general to take a look at how the laws affecting persons with disabilities and their right to vote can be implemented. So those three things we will take away from this panel, and we look forward to bringing more back to you in future discussions. So I want to thank our panelists for all that they've done. And now I have the pleasure of turning over the conversation to Lisa Shore, who is going to really, I think, help us with some additional data. Is that correct, Lisa?
Oh, yes, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. I'm a political scientist and a professor at Rutgers, as you mentioned. I'm the co-director of the Program for Disability Research with my colleague, Douglas Cruz. And we've been studying disability and voting since the 1990s. So I want to make just a few brief points. First, there's been this stubborn voter turnout gap between people with and without disabilities of between 5 and 6 percentage points in general elections. In 2020, the gap was 5.7 points. Now, this is not due to lower interest in elections among people with disabilities. Well, some of the gap is tied to lower levels of education and income and greater social isolation. Inaccessible voting systems clearly discourage turnout. And as we've been discussing, barriers include things like getting into the polling place or knowing how to read the ballot or to vote. We conducted national surveys on disability and voting accessibility, sponsored by the Election Assistance Commission after the 2012 and 2020 elections. In the 2020 election, we found that 11% of voters with disabilities reported some type of disability voting, which is twice the rate of voters without disabilities. And again, these problems included getting into polling places, standing in line, broken equipment, reading or filling out the ballot, etc. But the good news here is there has been improvement. Significantly fewer voters with disabilities in 2020 reported difficulties than in 2012, when 26%, over a quarter, of voters with disabilities reported having difficulty voting. The improvement is in part due to greater polling place accessibility, which is a credit to efforts by election officials and policymakers. But part of the improvement is tied to changes in voting procedures that made it easier to vote in 2020. And as you mentioned, these include things like voting by mail, drop boxes, early voting, extended registration deadlines. Many of these changes were made in response to the COVID pandemic. We've analyzed the Census Bureau's voting and registration supplement, which gathers data after each national election, thank you, on over 80,000 citizens who are eligible to vote. We just released a fact sheet that looks at changes in turnout between 2016 and 2020 among people with and without disabilities. And we made comparisons between states that did and did not implement various voting reforms. Now, the nature of the data do not allow us to show causation, but we controlled for important factors such as demographic differences and electoral competitiveness. Our best estimate is that the reforms were associated with an additional 586,600 voters with disabilities and 882,800 voters without disabilities. So the reforms accounted for 35% of the increased turnout of people with disabilities in 2020, as shown on the graph. The main lesson we take here is that reforms matter. Reforms that make it easier to vote for everyone, especially help people with disabilities. And given the wide variety in types of disabilities and levels of impairment, One size clearly does not fit all. Voting by mail, for example, can be a great option for many people with mobility impairments and other types of disabilities, but it can make it difficult or impossible for a blind voter to vote confidentially and without assistance. So having more options maximizes the chances for that people with disabilities will find a method that fits their needs. And conversely, changes that make it more difficult to vote are especially likely to harm people with disabilities. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. This has been really an outstanding program, and I so appreciate your additional factual information and your data presentation. Very, very helpful. I believe we have time, do we, for one or two questions? Is that still operative at this point, colleagues? Danny and others?
I think we might be out of time for questions if we're going to go to Maria for her presentation and to
I
the
see.
close. But
I
we could
see.
respond to people afterward.
Then I will sign off and send this to Maria. Thank you, Danny.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Town, and I serve as the president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. I am a white woman wearing a black top, a tweed jacket, red lipstick, and red jewelry. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am very grateful to the Century Foundation and to the Shanker Institute for sponsoring today's event, and specifically to Ralph Nees for organizing. I'm also grateful to my fellow speakers and that incredible panel for sharing their wisdom and compelling remarks. In reflecting on today's presentations, I am struck most particularly by one thing. I'm struck by the fragility of our democracy. Democracy can be denied via everything from sweeping actions of state legislatures to a single broken accessible voting machine. But there are tangible, actionable steps that we can take to strengthen our democracy and make it more resilient. One of these things is policy change, which you've just heard quite a bit about in the previous panel. In addition to pursuing policy change, to strengthen our democracy, we must also organize, and we must organize now. AAPD is doing this through our Rev Up initiative. Rev Up is a national nonpartisan initiative that brings together state, local, and national organizations working to advance the disability vote with the mission of fostering civic engagement and protecting the voting rights of Americans with disabilities. Every year, Rev Up partners with hundreds of organizations in over half of all of our states. And our long-term goal is to have a Rev Up Disability Vote Coalition in every state, as well as tribal nations, on college campuses, and more. In order to achieve this goal, we're working to build 5 new coalitions every year through working with and supporting grassroots organizations who already understand the local context in their communities, because as we know, all elections are local. As a national organization, a key principle of how we approach advocates who have been doing this work in their communities is understanding how their wins have been achieved and where they need further support to support their success. Our existing Rev Up coalitions have actively advocated against these damaging anti-voting laws, which you've all heard about. We have coalitions who are involved in voter registration drives and grassroots mobilizations, particularly during National Disability Voter Registration Week. Rev Up also works to educate candidates on the disability community's priorities and concerns and hosts candidate and issue forums, again, in every election from the presidential elections to local city and county commissioners. In our coalition work, it is critical that we build meaningful partnerships with the broader civil rights movement. As you've all heard, people with disabilities are a part of every community, particularly multiply marginalized communities who are experiencing voter suppression along the lines of racism, sexism, ageism, and suppression that particularly targets people living in poverty. By recognizing that disability rights are civil and human rights, we recognize that our struggles are inextricably tied. And if we do not see the outcomes of our work together and successes for one another, we miss key opportunities to benefit large swaths of people who increasingly will be forced out of our democracy. There is actually the potential for this to happen in the Freedom to Vote Act. While the Freedom to Vote Act would enshrine many of the changes we need to see in order to increase voter access, the bill also contains a paper ballot mandate, which would limit the voting options for many voters with disabilities, particularly people with print disabilities like blindness, intellectual disabilities, and people who have motor disabilities impacting their motor skills. The paper ballot mandate in the Freedom to Vote Act would limit the progress we've seen in states like Delaware, Nevada, and West Virginia, which currently allow electronic voting, electronic ballot return. This is an example of where we are not working in solidarity with one another. And as has been stressed by our previous panelists, solutions that center multiply marginalized disabled people make it easier to vote for everyone. Again, we need to organize, which means we need to build our grassroots infrastructure. Any of you who are interested in joining Rev Up and advancing the disability vote work with your community, please visit our website at aapd.com/revup and let us know you want to join the movement by filling out our sign-up form. You can join one of over 200 partner organizations, join an existing Rev Up coalition, or start your own. And I want to make sure to highlight that we now have micro grants available for entities and existing Rev Up coalitions and for people who want to start new Rev Up coalitions. We've got to get ready for midterm elections as soon as possible. And one of the ways that we're trying to do that is by supporting local organizers to pay for things like accessibility when doing voter registration drives. I want to circle back to a quote that Ralph Mees opened with from AAPD's founder, Justin Dart. Vote like your life depends on it because it does. I come back to this quote because it's a way of acknowledging the present moment. We are still in a global pandemic, one that has drastically and disproportionately impacted disabled people, particularly disabled people of color. In the past year and a half, we have had to say over and over and over again that our lives deserve to be protected, that we deserve to be saved, as states have decided that disabled people don't need critical life-saving care. In 2020, though voting access improved, people with disabilities were twice as likely to face barriers at the polls. And one example of this, Black disabled people, this is data from Lisa, were shown to wait twice as long in lines as white disabled people. There are 38 million eligible voters with disabilities. Imagine how much the disability community could impact elections and the policies that come from those elections if the voting process was not so consistently inaccessible. When I think about why voting rights matter to people with disabilities, I know that voting is a way that we as the disability community, a community that is too often silenced and shunned into the shadows, voting is a way to say that we are here, that we deserve to be here, and we deserve to live in a world that works for us and with us. Voting is a way that we can self-direct our own lives and have a say in so many of the things that are important to us. And so to conclude, I want to say thank you. Thank you for your commitment to expanding voting access for disabled people, for people of color, for LGBTQIA two-spirit people, for poor people. Thank you for your commitment to shaping our future and ensuring that everyone, including disabled people, can participate in democracy equally and equitably and live and work in a nation that allows them to thrive in every aspect of life. And now it is my pleasure to pass it over to our grand organizer, Senior Counsel at the Century Foundation, Ralph Mees.
Ralph, are you there?
I'm back. I'm sorry, everybody. I just want to thank everybody for a superb panel. Everyone did a terrific job. A special shout out to Senator Duckworth, our congressional champion, and of course, a thanks for everybody who's been in attendance. Please, let's keep in touch. We can all be reached at tcf.org or schenker.org. A recording will be made and immediately available by tcf.org. And the last thing I want to say, we've talked about disability rights being civil rights and human rights. One reason that Mark Zuckerman and Mary Catherine Ricker and Danny and myself and others said, let's do disability rights. Well, there's one civil rights more important than any other one. And of course, that's voting rights, whether it's employment, education, transportation, public accommodation, communications, everything depends on voting rights. Hopefully we'll be in touch. And as Justin used to say, solidarity